They let him live if he married every daughter. The mud was a promise. It clung to Ilias's knees, a thick, greedy clay the color of old blood, and it promised him a grave. Above him, the blade was a sliver of captured sky, impossibly sharp against the oppressive green of the jungle canopy. It trembled in a hand weathered by sun and certainty, the hand of the man who was both judge and king of this forgotten valley. The man's name was Varden, and his face was a mask of granite and grief. Round them, the village watched, a silent circle of women and children, their eyes dark, unreadable pools reflecting the flickering torchlight. There were no other men. Elias had learned that fact too late. He could feel the sharp edge of the blade press against the sweat-slicked skin of his throat. A cold, final punctuation marked to a life of academic failures and quiet desperation had come to this isolated slash in the earth's crust, seeking a flower, a mythical orchid said to halt the aging of cells. A discovery that would scrub the stain of disgrace from his name. Instead, he'd found a people trapped in time, a living ghost. He had broken their one inviolable law. He had entered the grove of whispering mothers, a place where the souls of their dead were said to be spun into the silk of giant nocturnal moths. It was a trespass that demanded blood. Ilias's breath hitched. His mind, usually a fortress of logic and scientific reason, was a maelstrom of raw animal fear. He thought of his pathetic, empty apartment in a city thousands of miles away, the unanswered emails, the shame that had become his shadow. It was a bleak life, but it was his, and it was ending here, in the mud, for a flower. Varden's voice was low, rough as riverstone. The outsider's blood must feed the soil that he profaned. This is the law. A murmur rippled through the women, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. Elias braced for the shearing pain, the final darkness. But then, a different voice, softer but laced with steel, cut through the tension. Father, there is another way. Elias dared to lift his eyes. It was Varden's eldest daughter, Alara. She stood beside him, her posture as rigid as a spear, her face a beautiful, severe sculpture. She did not look at Elias. Her gaze was fixed on her father. Varden's blade did not waver. There is no other way. The spirits of the mothers cry out for balance. The spirits also cry for a future. She countered, her voice ringing with an authority that belied her years. Our valley is dying. You know this. The blight took the men. The cradles are empty. The mothers whisper, but no new souls arrive to listen. The air grew thick, heavy with a sorrow Elias could now sense was deeper than just his own impending. Death. It was the collective grief of a people on the brink of extinction. Varden finally lowered the blade a fraction of an inch, his knuckles white. What are you saying, daughter? Alara's chin lifted. She looked past her father, her eyes sweeping over the crowd, and for the first time, they landed on Elias. They were not eyes of pity, but of cold, hard calculation. The law says blood must be given, but a life is also blood, a life given. In service is a greater offering than one spilled in the dirt. He is a man. He is strong. His blood is new. The implication hung in the humid air, unspoken, shocking, and yet suddenly terrifyingly logical. Varden stared at his daughter, then at Elias, his gaze no longer that of an executioner, but of a farmer assessing livestock. A silence stretched, pulled taut by a horrifying new possibility. Finally, Varden spoke. His voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the very ground. He sheathed his blade. The sound of steel sliding into leather was the loudest thing Elias had ever heard. He will not die. Varden declared to the village, his voice booming with a renewed, terrible purpose. He will live. He will restore the balance. He turned his full attention to Elias, a predatory gleam in his eyes that was far more frightening than the blade had been. They will let you live, he said, his words slow, deliberate, each one a stone laid on the path to a new kind of damnation. He gestured with his chin, and from the shadows behind him, 3 more young women emerged to stand beside Alara, 4 of them, 4 daughters, a different facet of this strange, suffocating world. The proposition was not a reprieve, it was a cage. It was a life sentence. And as Elias looked from the hard, defiant eyes of Alara to the wide, haunted gaze of the second, the sly, curious smirk of the third, and the withdrawn, almost invisible posture of the fourth, a single, paralyzing question screamed through the chaos in his mind. Was this a choice at all? His life before the valley had been a study in quiet erosion. Dr. Elias Vance, a promising ethnobotanist whose career had imploded in a scandal of his own making. It wasn't fraud, not exactly. It was worse. It was arrogance, he had announced. The discovery of a grain in the Andes, one he claimed could end famine, a supercrop resistant to drought and blight. He'd rushed the publication, hungry for the accolades, the grants. The redemption it would bring from a childhood spent in the shadow of a brilliant, dismissive father. He'd ignored the warnings of his junior partner, a cautious, meticulous woman named Anya. The grain, it turned out, was subtly toxic. It didn't kill, it sterilized. The ensuing fallout had been catastrophic. His funding was pulled, his reputation shredded. Anya had taken the public blame, a quiet, dignified scapegoat for his ambition. The shame of it was a physical thing, a sour taste in his mouth that never went away. He'd come to this remote corner of the world chasing a myth, the orchid of perpetuity, a last desperate gamble to rewrite his legacy. His journal, now in Varden's possession, was filled with notes on floral biology. Between the lines, it was a chronicle of flight. He wasn't just seeking a discovery. He was running from himself. The valley, with its impossible geography, a sinkhole of life, accessible only through a treacherous, half-submerged cave system, was supposed to be his sanctuary and his laboratory. He hadn't counted on it being inhabited. He hadn't counted on the KYN now. His new world was the Longhouse, a cavernous wooden structure that smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and something else, something cloyingly sweet like rotting fruit. He was given a small, windowless chamber, a cell with a woven mat for a bed. His life was no longer measured in hours and minutes, but in the silent, watchful presence of the 4 women who were to be his wives. The marriage was not an event, but a process, a slow, horrifying assimilation. No ceremony, no celebration. There was only the decree and the slow, suffocating reality that followed. He was to learn their ways, their language, their rhythms. He was a stud horse, a genetic savior, a prisoner in all but name. But a prisoner feels the injustice, the desire. For escape, Elias felt something far more complex, a creeping sense of inevitability, a blurring of the line between revulsion and estrange. A scent curiosity. Ilara, the eldest, was his warden. In her early 20s, she carried herself with the weight of someone much older. She assigned him tasks, mending fishing nets with his clumsy, academic fingers, hauling water from the river until his back screamed, learning to identify the edible, roots from the poisonous ones, under her sharp, unforgiving gaze. Her beauty was severe, all sharp angles and unyielding pride. She spoke to him in commands, her eyes never meeting his for more than a fleeting, dismissive second. He could feel her disdain like a physical force. She was doing this for her people, a sacrifice she clearly found distasteful. He was a tool, and she would wield him as such. The knots must be tight. No, she would say, her voice flat, gesturing at his pathetic attempt at a net. A loose knot means an empty belly. Here we do not tolerate weakness. Her hands would move with a fluid, practiced grace, her knuckles brushing his, sending a jolt through him that was neither pleasant nor unpleasant, merely electric. He saw in her the burden of being first, the crushing weight of responsibility. She was the one holding the world together. He was just another complication she had to manage. Then there was Serafina, the second daughter. She was the valley's mystic, its dreamer. Where Alara was earth and stone, Serafina was mist and moonlight. She moved with a silent, gliding grace, her eyes often unfocused, as if she were seeing a world layered on top of this one. What? sit with him not to teach him tasks, but to tell him the stories of the kin. The legends of the silkworm mothers and the blight that had stolen the men. Her voice was a hypnotic, reedy whisper. The mothers weep, she told him one evening, as they sat by the central fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on her ethereal face. The blight came when a man a generation ago brought a stone. From the outside, a stone that did not know the valley's song. It sang a song of discord, and our men's souls forgot the way back to their bodies. She looked at him, her gaze finely sharp, pinning him. You are the new song, Elias. A harsh one, perhaps, but one that might teach the valley to sing again. He wanted to tell her about viruses, about genetic bottlenecks, about the science that almost certainly explained their tragedy. But in her presence, his science felt like a blunt, clumsy instrument. She was seducing him not with her body, but with a narrative, a cosmology where he was not a disgraced botanist, but a prophesied figure. It was a terrifyingly appealing thought. It soothed the raw, gaping wound of his failure. To be a new song was infinitely better than being a fraud. The third was Lyra. If Alara was duty and Seraphina was spirit, Lyra was pure, untamed life force. She was the youngest, maybe 17 or 18, with a restless energy that seemed to strain against the valley's oppressive tranquility. Her eyes were full of a mocking intelligence and a constant simmering curiosity about him, the outsider. She was the only one who seemed unafraid. She would watch him while he worked, a sly smile playing on her lips. She didn't command or prophesy. She provoked. Your hands are soft, she said one day, grabbing his wrist as he struggled to strip bark from a log. Her touch was warm, firm, like a baby's. She laughed, a bright, startling sound in the quiet longhouse. Tell me about the outside. Are all the men there so soft? Her questions were relentless, a barrage against the walls of his isolation. She wanted to know about cities, about music he couldn't describe, about a world of choices she couldn't imagine. In her, Elias saw a mirror of his own past desire for escape, but hers was purer, untainted by failure. She wasn't running from something. She was desperate to run to something. She was the first to make him feel less like a specimen and more like a man. Her presence was a constant, low-grade fever, a reminder of a world of impulse and desire. He thought he had left behind, and finally there was Orla, the fourth daughter. The silent one. Orla was a ghost in her own family. She was perhaps a year or two older than Lyra, but she existed in a world of her own making, a world without words. She never spoke, not to him, not to her sisters, not even to her father. Communicated with a language of subtle gestures, of averted eyes, of the slight, almost imperceptible tilt of her head. Most of the time she was simply not there, fading into the background, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. But Elias started to notice her watching him. When he fumbled with a tool and cursed under his breath, he'd catch a flicker of something in her eyes' amusement. Pity. When he managed a task correctly, a small, almost invisible nod. She was the valley's deepest mystery. Her silence wasn't empty, it was full. It was a vessel containing some immense unspoken thing. He found himself thinking about her, more than the others. Her silence was a blank page, and he was terrified to find himself wanting to write his own meaning upon it. It was with Orla that he felt the most profound culture shock. In his world, communication was everything. Here, the most compelling presence was the one who refused it. Days bled into weeks. The shock began to dull, replaced by a strange, disorienting routine. He was caught in a gravitational pull of 4 distinct worlds. With Alara, he felt the grudging respect of a subordinate earning his place. With Seraphina, the heady intoxication of being part of a myth. With Lyra, the dangerous thrill of a shared secret, a flicker of rebellion. With Orla, a deep, unsettling empathy, a connection that transcended language. The moral calculus of his situation grew murkier. This was polygamy, a concept his Western mind recoiled from. It was barbaric, a violation of his autonomy and theirs. He was a prisoner, they were his keepers. And yet, were they? The daughters were bound by this decree as much as he was. Were sacrificing their lives, their futures, for the survival of their people. Who was the real victim here? The question gnawed at him during the long, humid nights. He would lie on his mat, the sounds of the jungle a throbbing symphony outside, and he would think of Anya. He had sacrificed her career for his ambition. Varden was sacrificing his daughters for his people. Was one act nobler than the other? Or was it all just selfishness, dressed in different clothes? He started to see them not as a collective, the daughters, but as individuals. Each with her own hopes and fears, each trapped in a role she hadn't chosen. A dangerous thought began to take root in his mind, a thought that felt like a betrayal of his own past, his own world. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was, in some strange, terrifying way, beginning to belong. The temptation was no longer just about staying alive. The temptation was the life itself. He would look at the four of them, the pillar of strength, the keeper of dreams, the spark of rebellion, the vessel of silence, and the question that echoed in his soul was no longer how can I escape this, but the far more terrifying what if I don't want to. The first crack in the dam of his resistance came with Lyra. It was a moonless night, the air so thick with humidity you could drink it. He was lying on his mat, asleep a distant country, when a shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows of the doorway. It was her. She pressed a finger to her lips, her eyes gleaming in the faint starlight filtering through the roof slats. She beckoned with a jerk of her head. He followed her without a conscious thought. His body moved, his mind a silent, screaming spectator. They slipped out of the longhouse, past the sleeping forms, into the nocturnal jungle. The world outside was an alien landscape of glowing fungi and the chittering calls of unseen creatures. Lyra moved through it with the confidence of a creature born to the dark. She led him down a barely there path, the air growing cooler, the sound of rushing water growing louder. They arrived at a hidden cove, where a waterfall cascaded into a deep black pool, the spray kicking up a fine, cool mist. It was a place of profound secret beauty. "This is my place," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the water's roar. "I come here when the longhouse feels like a tomb." She turned to him, her silhouette framed by the faint luminescence of the water. "You hate it here, don't you?" "Different," he managed, his voice hoarse. "Don't lie," she said, stepping closer. He could smell the scent of the river on her skin, of damp earth and night-blooming flowers. "You want to leave? You dream of your other world?" "Yes." He admitted the word a painful confession. "Take me with you," she breathed, the words a sudden, shocking plea. Her hand found his in the dark. Her fingers were warm, alive. "When you find a way out, take me. I'll be your wife there, a real wife, not a quarter of one." The raw, desperate desire in her voice struck him like a physical blow. It was the first time any of them had spoken of a future that deviated from Varden's plan. She wasn't just a rebel. She was a dreamer, just like Serafina, but her dreams were of escape, of a world she could only imagine through his stories. "Lyra, I." She didn't let him finish. She rose on her toes and kissed him. It wasn't a gentle or romantic kiss. It was fierce, hungry, a desperate attempt to taste freedom. It was a kiss of rebellion, of shared conspiracy. His mind screamed at him to pull away. This was wrong. It was a betrayal of the fragile, unspoken truce he had with the other sisters. It was a betrayal of the order of this place. But his body, starved of touch, of choice, of simple human connection, responded before his mind could regain control. He kissed her back, his hands finding her waist, pulling her closer. It was a moment of pure, selfish indulgence. A moment where he wasn't the genetic savior or the disgraced scientist. He was just a man, and she was a woman, and in the darkness, they were clinging to each other as if they were the only two people in the world. The wrongness of it was precisely what made it feel so intoxicatingly real. It was a secret just for them. For a few frantic, heart-pounding moments, he wasn't a prisoner marrying for women. He was a man kissing one. And in that moment, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, a dangerous, thrilling, selfish flicker of want. Wanted this. He wanted her. And that desire was a poison that would slowly, inevitably, seep into everything. The aftermath of that night was a subtle shift in the valley's emotional tectonics. Lyra now carried a secret in her eyes when she looked at him, a shared spark that was invisible to the others, but felt like a brand on his skin. It made his interactions with her sisters fraught with a new kind of tension. His lessons with Alara became almost unbearable. Her cold efficiency felt like an accusation. When her hand brushed his as she showed him how to properly gut a fish, he would flinch, imagining Lyra's kiss. Alara would notice, her brow furrowing in a new kind of suspicion. The disdain in her eyes was now mixed with something else, a flicker of personal female curiosity. Was he failing at this task too? Was he truly that weak? Or was something else at play? "Your mind is not on the river," she said one afternoon, her voice sharp as she watched him let a prized fish slip from his grasp. "It is somewhere else. The outside world calls to you so strongly?" "No," he lied, his heart hammering. "Tiredness is a luxury," she snapped, but her eyes lingered on him, searching his face for a truth he couldn't afford to reveal. He started to see the cracks in her stoic facade. He saw the way she watched the village children, a deep, painful longing in her gaze. Her sacrifice wasn't just an abstract duty, it was personal. She was giving up the chance at a normal life, a single love, for the hope of future generations. And he, the instrument of that hope, was already proving to be complicated and unreliable. He began to feel not just fear of her, but a strange, protective pity. His time with Serafina became even more disorienting. The prophecies grew more pointed, more possessive. She no longer spoke of the valley's song, but of their song. "I saw you in a dream," she whispered, her eyes wide and luminous in the firelight. "We're walking away, and the valley was turning to dust behind you. But one of us was holding your hand, and where she held on, the green remained." She leaned closer, her breath smelling of the mild narcotic herbs she often chewed. Which hand was it, Elias? Which sister kept the world alive? He felt like a specimen under a microscope. She was weaving him into her spiritual tapestry, making his every move, every choice, a matter of cosmic importance. His secret kiss with Lyra felt cheap and profane in the face of her ethereal intensity. Was he the new song, or the song of discord? Serafina seemed to believe he was both, a paradox that could either save or shatter them, and her belief was so powerful it was starting to infect him. He felt the weight of her faith as a physical burden. And then there was Orla, his secret. With Lyra changed his interactions with the silent sister most profoundly. Before, her silence had been a mystery. Now it felt like a judgment. He would find her gaze on him from across the longhouse, her dark, expressive eyes holding a deep, unreadable sorrow. She had seen him and Lyra sneak out that night. Sure of it, but she said nothing, did nothing. Her silence was not passive. It was an active choice. She was holding his secret. The weight of that unacknowledged complicity was heavier than any spoken accusation. He started seeking her out. Not to talk, but just to be in her presence. He would help her with her tasks tending to the small garden of medicinal herbs behind the longhouse, a place the others rarely went. They would work for hours without a single word passing between them. He learned her language of gesture, the slight dip of her chin that meant thank you, the way she would touch a leaf to show him which one to pick. One afternoon, as they were weeding, a thorn from a thistle-like plant embedded itself deep in his palm. He swore, trying to pull it out, but it was lodged painfully. Orla stopped her work and came to him. She gently took his hand, her touch surprisingly firm. He braced for her to try and yank it out, but she didn't. Instead, she met his eyes, a clear, direct gaze, and then gestured for him to sit and wait. She disappeared for a moment and returned with a poultice of chewed leaves, which she carefully applied to the wound. Then she took a small, sharp sliver of obsidian and, with a surgeon's precision, worked the thorn loose. The entire exchange took place in complete silence, but it was the most intimate moment he had experienced in the valley. more intimate than Lyra's desperate kiss, more profound than Seraphine's prophecies, more real than Alira's grudging lessons, was a moment of pure, selfless care. In her silence, he felt no judgment, no expectation, no desire, just a simple human connection. He looked at her focused expression, her gentle hands, and felt a wave of emotion so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. It was a feeling of deep, aching tenderness. He wasn't just a body, a set of genes to her. He was a person who was hurt. This was the most dangerous development of all. His illicit thrill with Lyra was a desire for escape. His growing respect for Alara was a bond of shared duty. His entanglement with Seraphina was a dance with prophecy. But his connection with Orla, it felt dangerously close to something he had no right to feel. It was quiet. It was patient. And it was growing in the silence like a seed in the dark. Fertile Earth, the polygamous arrangement was no longer a simple, horrifying contract. It had become a complex web of relationships, each pulling at him in a different direction. He was being torn apart and remade, his own morality blurring with every passing day. The lines between duty, desire, faith, and a new, terrifying form of love were becoming impossible to distinguish. Varden watched it all unfold with a grim, patriarchal satisfaction. He saw the burgeoning connections, the subtle jealousies, the slow assimilation. To him, it was all going according to plan. "You are becoming one of the kin," he said to Elias one evening, clapping a heavy hand on his shoulder. It was meant as a compliment, a sign of acceptance. But to Elias, it felt like the closing of a cage door. "The mothers will soon have reason to sing." The mention of the mothers sent a chill down his spine. He was part of a breeding program, a holy one, wrapped in myth and tradition, but a breeding program nonetheless. And as he looked across the fire at the four distinct faces of his future, he felt a profound sense of vertigo. He was caught between four gravitational forces: Elara's pragmatism, Seraphine's mysticism, Lyra's rebellious passion, and Orla's silent, soul-deep empathy. Each one offered a different kind of salvation and a different kind of damnation. He was being woven into the fabric of this family, this culture, this valley. And he realized with a jolt of pure terror that if he ever managed to cut himself free, he wouldn't know what piece of himself he'd be leaving behind. The escalating stakes weren't just about life and death anymore. They were about his very soul. The crisis arrived not with a roar, but with a whimper. A child in the village developed a fever, a dry, rasping cough, and a strange bluish tint to her lips. Then another. Within a week, a dozen children were sick, their small bodies struggling for breath in the humid air of the longhouse. The blight. The same sickness that had stolen the men was back, this time to claim the young. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the valley's placid surface. The women gathered, their faces etched with a familiar terror. Varden, who had seemed an immovable mountain of authority, suddenly looked old and frail. He stared at the sick children, his jaw tight with a helplessness that was more terrifying than his anger had ever been. Seraphina led the rituals. She burned sacred herbs, the smoke thick and acrid. She chanted the old songs, her voice raw with desperation, pleading with the whispering mothers to spare the children. But the sickness spread. The coughs grew weaker, the small chests struggling. Harder, the valley was holding its breath, waiting for death. Elias, the botanist, watched with a growing sense of horror and a terrible, dawning realization. The symptoms, the fever, the respiratory distress, the cyanosis were not some mystical blight. They were classic signs of a severe bacterial pneumonia, likely exacerbated by the valley's constant humidity and the enclosed, smoky environment of the longhouse. In his world, this was treatable. Devastating, yes, but not a death sentence, and he knew the cure. Before entering the valley, on the slopes of the outer mountains, he had documented a specific type of lichen, one that grew in abundance on the north-facing rocks. He knew from his studies that this particular species, Usnea barbata, was a potent natural antibiotic. A simple infusion, a tea made from the lichen, could likely halt the infection in its tracks. The knowledge burned in him, like a hot coal. He was a scientist. He had a moral, ethical duty to act, the same duty he had failed with Anya. Here was a chance, a real chance, at redemption. Not the fame-seeking redemption he had chased, but a real, tangible act of saving lives. He went to Varden. He found the patriarch sitting alone, staring into the fire, his great shoulders slumped. Elias explained, his voice low and urgent, what he suspected. He spoke of bacteria, of infection, of the lichen and its properties. Varden listened, his face an unreadable mask. When Elias finished, the old man was silent for a long time. Then he shook his head, a slow, final gesture. "No," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "The blight is a spiritual matter. 'Tis the anger of the mothers. We have our own herbs, our own rituals." He gestured toward Orla's garden. "Seraphina speaks with the spirits. We must trust the old ways. The old ways are failing." Elias hissed, his frustration boiling over. "Children are dying. This isn't about spirits. It's about biology." "You are the outsider," Varden roared, his authority returning in a flash of anger. "You do not understand our balance. To use your outside medicine would be a greater profanity than stepping in the grove. It would be an admission that our faith is worthless, that the mothers have abandoned us. It would break the spirit of our people forever. I forbid it." The decree was absolute. Elias was stunned into silence. Varden was willing to sacrifice the children on the altar of his tradition. It was madness. It was murder. He sought out the sisters, hoping for an ally. Seraphina was lost in her trances, her eyes glassy, her hands stained with herbal dyes. She looked at him with pity. "You must have faith, Elias. Your song is strong, but you cannot force it. Valley must heal itself." He found Lyra by the river, skipping stones across the water with a frantic, angry energy. Her face was pale with fear. Her youngest cousin was among the sickest. "He's a stubborn old fool." Told her of Varden's refusal. "He'd rather see us all die than admit his world is too small." She grabbed Ilias's arm, her eyes pleading. "You have to do it, Elias. Secretly. Please, save them." The choice was now stark, a razor's edge. Obey Varden and watch the children die, preserving the cultural integrity of a people on the brink of extinction. Or defy him, save the children, but potentially shatter the foundations of their entire world. It was the same dilemma he'd faced with his research, but the stakes were infinitely higher. There, it had been his ambition versus Anya's caution. Here, it was his science versus their soul. He was paralyzed. He paced his small chamber like a caged animal. What gave him the right? He was the outsider, the profaner. To impose his knowledge on them felt like the ultimate act of colonial arrogance, the very thing he, as an anthropologist, was trained to abhor. But to stand by and do nothing felt like complicity in their deaths. The breaking point came that night. The longhouse was filled with the sound of shallow, labored breathing. The child who had first fallen ill, a little girl named Kelia, was fading. Her mother wept silently beside her, her body shaking with grief. Varden himself was now sick, a deep rattling cough shaking his powerful frame. He had caught it from the children. The patriarch was falling. Elias looked at Ilara. She stood by her father's mat, her face a mask of conflict, torn between her duty to her father's command and the sight of her dying people. Her eyes met Ilias's across the firelit space, and in them he saw no answers, only a shared, silent agony. Then he saw Orla. She was kneeling beside Kelia, wiping the child's brow with a cool, damp cloth. She looked up, and her gaze found his. There was no ambiguity in her eyes. There was only a desperate, silent plea. It was a look that said, "Do something. Anything." It cut through his paralysis, through the layers of ethical debate and cultural relativism. It was a simple, human appeal from one heart to another. That was it. That was the moment. The decision was made not in his head, but in his gut. He slipped out of the longhouse, grabbing a basket. He didn't care who saw him. He ran, fueled by adrenaline and a terrifying clarity, following the path to the cave that led out of the valley. He knew the lichen grew in the damp, shaded entrance. It would be a dangerous journey in the dark, but he didn't hesitate. He returned. Hours later, bruised, battered, his basket filled with the stringy, gray-green lichen. The longhouse was quieter now, as the air was thick with the premonition of death. Varden was delirious, his breathing shallow. Kelia was barely stirring. Elias strode to the central fire, ignoring the shocked gasps. He took a cooking pot, filled it with water, and began preparing the infusion. Lara rushed to his side. "What are you doing?" "My father forbade this." "Your father is dying," Elias said, his voice hard, emotionless. "And he's taking the rest of you with him." Serafina appeared, her eyes blazing with fury. "You are profaning our home. You are silencing the mothers." She tried to knock the pot from his hands. Elias grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron. "Your mothers are silent because your children are dead," he snarled, his own pain and fear erupting his anger. "My science may not have a soul, but it will keep their hearts beating." It was the unforgivable decision, a violent, arrogant act of defiance. He was forcing his world upon theirs, violating their most sacred beliefs in their moment of greatest weakness. He was becoming the monster. They feared the outsider who sings a song of discord. He pushed past them, the hot, bitter-smelling tea in a bowl. He knelt beside Kelia first, gently prying open her lips, letting the liquid trickle into her mouth. Her mother watched, her face a mess of hope and terror. Then he went to the other children. Some drank, some he had to force. Finally, he stood. Before Varden, the great patriarch was barely conscious. Alara stood between them, her body a rigid barrier. "No," she whispered, tears finally tracking down her stoic face. "Not him. Let him die with his faith." "He doesn't have to die," Elias said softly, his anger spent, leaving only a vast, aching emptiness. "None of you do." Looked at Alara, his eyes pleading with her to understand. This wasn't about being right. It was about what came after. Had to save the man who had imprisoned him, the man whose world he was now destroying. It was a terrible, twisted act of love and vengeance and mercy, all at once. He saw the fight go out of her. She stepped aside. Elias knelt and administered the medicine to the man who had condemned him to this life. As the bitter tea touched Varden's lips, Elias felt a profound sense of ruin. He had made his choice. He had chosen science over spirit, survival over tradition, his redemption over their beliefs. He had saved their bodies. But he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he had just murdered their world. And in the silence of the longhouse, surrounded by the women who were his wives and his accusers, he had never felt more alone. The climax was not a victory. It was a desecration. The lichen worked. Within 2 days, the fevers began to break. The coughing subsided. The bluish tint faded from the children's skin. Color returned to the valley, life pushing back against the gray shroud of death. Elias was a hero. He was a savior. He was also the most hated man in the village. The women would not look at him. They accepted the food he provided, the work he did, but they moved around him as if he were a ghost, a walking embodiment of their broken faith. Serafina refused to speak to him at all, her face a mask of grief and betrayal. She no longer spoke of prophecies. She performed only the quiet rites of mourning for a world that was gone. Lyra, who had begged him to act, now looked at him with a new kind of fear. It was not the romantic rebel she had imagined, but a man capable of a terrible world-breaking power. The secret spark between them was extinguished, replaced by the ashes of what he had done. Ilara treated him with a cold, formal correctness that was worse than her previous disdain. He had saved her father and her people, but he had done it. By proving her entire life, her entire system of belief was built on a fragile lie. Only Orla remained unchanged. Her silent companionship continued, a single, stable point in his new, fractured reality. But even her silence felt different, heavier, freighted with the enormity of his actions. The true cataclysm, however, came when Varden was strong enough. To speak, he summoned Elias and his 4 daughters to the center of the longhouse. The old man looked diminished, his strength sapped, not just by the illness, but by something deeper. The fire in his eyes was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunted emptiness. "You saved us," Varden said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "And you have destroyed us." He looked at Seraphina, whose face was a stone. "The mothers are silent now, aren't they, daughter? Their whispers were only the echoes of our own fears." He turned his gaze to Elias, and what Elias saw there was not anger, but a profound, soul-crushing weariness. "I owe you the truth," Varden said, his voice cracking. "All of you." Took a deep, shuddering breath. "There is no curse. There was never a stone of discord, the blight. It is in our blood. It has always been in our blood." A stunned silence filled the longhouse. The sisters stared at their father, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. "Our ancestors," Varden continued, his voice barely a whisper, "they were a single family, seeking refuge here centuries ago. We are all children of the same line. Our blood is too close. The men were born with a weakness in their lungs. Every few generations it claims them. It is not a spirit's anger. It is the simple, cruel math of inheritance." He had known. All along he had known the truth was genetic, not spiritual. The superstitions, the legends of the mothers, they were lies. Beautiful, intricate lies constructed over generations to explain a tragedy they couldn't otherwise bear. But the twist, the revelation that reframed everything, was yet to come. "Watched my brothers die," Varden said, his eyes unfocused, lost in the past. "I watched my sons cough their lives into their hands. I knew the next generation would be the last. The bloodline was at an end." He paused, and his eyes found Elias. "And then you came, the outsider. I found your journal after you were captured. I read your words. Ethnobotanist, genetic diversity, pathogens. I did not understand all the words, but I understood enough. You were not just a man with new blood. You were a man of knowledge." The air crackled with the unspoken truth. Elias felt a cold dread snaked its way up his spine. "The prophecy Seraphina told you," Varden confessed, not looking at his second daughter. "The story of the new song. I planted those ideas in her mind when she was a child. I nurtured her visions. I shaped the narrative. Not a prophecy. It was a trap. A lure for the man I knew we would one day need." Seraphina let out a small, strangled cry, as if she had been physically struck. Her faith, her entire identity, had been a tool manipulated by her own father. "Made you trespass in the grove," Varden said, his voice utterly flat. "I had the path subtly altered while you slept, so you would wander into it. I needed a reason to condemn you, a reason that my people would accept. I needed a way to keep you here, to bind you to us." The whole story tilted on its axis. The trial, the sentence, the marriage, none of it was a reactive punishment. It was a calculated, premeditated act. Varden was not a desperate patriarch clinging to tradition. He was a ruthless pragmatist, a eugenicist, playing a long, cruel game. To save his people from extinction, he hadn't just offered Elias a deal to save his life. He had orchestrated the entire scenario to force Elias into becoming the genetic and intellectual savior of his line. "He let you live so you would marry us?" Elias said, her voice trembling with a rage so deep it was almost silent. "He captured you so you would save us. From him, from his lies." The revelation shattered the fragile peace of the valley. The daughters looked at their father as if he were a stranger. The love, the duty, the jealousy, the faith had all been built on a foundation of lies, manipulated by the man they trusted most. Lyra's dream of escape was now tainted. She had been a pawn in her father's game. Lyra's stoic sense of duty was a chain he had forged for her. Seraphin's spirit world was a cage he had built. And Elias was the ultimate victim. And the ultimate victor. He was free from the immediate threat of death, but he was more trapped than ever. He was no longer just a prisoner or a husband. He was the new patriarch, the keeper of the truth, the man who held their biological future. In his hands, he had come seeking a flower to cure aging and had instead become the cure for a dying bloodline. The final, haunting question hung in the air. What of Orla? What was the truth of her silence? Varden looked at his fourth daughter, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine, unscripted pain crossed his face. Orla, he began, but his voice failed him. It was Orla who finished the thought. She looked directly at Elias, her eyes clear and filled with a sorrow so vast it seemed to encompass the entire valley. And then she spoke. Her voice was raspy from disuse, but it was clear and steady. It was the first word she had ever uttered in his presence. It wasn't a word of love or thanks or forgiveness. It was a name, Mikkel. The name fell into the silence like a stone into a deep well. Varden flinched as if he'd been shot. He was the first of the young men to sicken. In the last cycle, the old man whispered, his confession complete. He and Orla, they were to be bound. Orla had not been born silent. She had chosen silence. A silence of grief for the boy she had loved, and a silence of protest against the father she knew was lying. Her wordless connection with Elias had not been one of simple empathy. She had seen in him another man trapped by her father's machinations. Her silent plea to him that night had not just been to save the children, it had been to shatter the lie that had stolen her own future. The lie that had taken her voice. Elias stood in the center of the longhouse. The hero and the homewrecker, the savior and the curse. He had 4 wives, a future lineage, and the burden of a truth that had poisoned every well of emotion in the valley. He looked at the women bound to him. Alara, her pride shattered, her duty revealed as a manipulation. Serafina, her faith eviscerated, her spirit world a fraud. Lyra, her rebellious hope curdled into horrified understanding. And Orla, the silent witness, who had finally spoken only to deliver the most devastating judgment of all. The story did not end. It simply continued into a new, more desolate chapter. The children were healthy, the blight was gone, but the valley was a graveyard of truths. Elias would live out his days there, a king in a kingdom of ghosts. He would father their children, teach them his science, and watch them grow. Knowing that the foundation of their new world was the rubble of the old one he had personally demolished. Months later, he stood on a ridge overlooking the valley, the setting sun painting the sky. In hues of orange and violet, the air was clean, the sounds of the village below, a gentle murmur of life continuing. It was peaceful. It was a lie. He felt a presence beside him and turned to see Orla. They stood together for a long time, watching the light fade. She never spoke his name. She never had to. Her first word had been for the dead. Her continued silence was for him, the living. It was a silence that bound him more tightly than any vow. He had a wife for every corner of his heart and a ghost for every less corner of the valley. He had survived. He had even, in a twisted way, succeeded. But as the last light of day bled from the sky, leaving him in the encroaching darkness, he understood that to be let live is not the same as being set free. And he wondered, not for the first time, if the blade at his throat all those months ago would have been a greater mercy.